Hey everyone, today is Wednesday, the 21st of February, 2024, and this is the Carpenter feature group meeting of the Cluster API community. It's just Jack and I, so I probably won't go over all the rules. So I just had a couple topics that I wanted to bring up. I guess I'll start with the quicker one, the repo. So I am making progress on setting up kind of the baseline for the repository, and I'm going to try and just set up a skeleton that we can have, and then we can start building from there. So I'm hopeful that in the next week or two I'll be able to open the request to have a repo there, and it won't do much aside from just kind of like hopefully boot up, and we'll have like the kube configs we need in place, and then it'll be able to talk to both clusters, and then we can start adding like all the functionality we need. So that's my hope there.
Cool. Is it gonna be a KubeBuilder init type project?
Well, no. So like looking at the way that the Carpenter projects are set up right now, it didn't look like they were using like KubeBuilder and init to set them up. Maybe I need to look at them again though. But like something that I'm trying to wrap my head around is that like it looks like Azure and AWS both use the ko.build service to build the containers for these things or whatever that project is. So like it's not clear to me how to just walk up to the project and make a binary out of it.
Yeah.
So what I was hopeful for was like in our version, I'd like to see a make file where you could just be like make binary and have it like give you the controller or whatever, so you can do whatever you need to with it. And I need to look at the API files because like, yeah, we're going to have some API scaffolding there. And obviously we'd want to use KubeBuilder for that, but I'm not quite sure where to draw the line between these two. Cause like I know KubeBuilder will add a bunch of extra stuff that we probably also won't need, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it probably doesn't, you probably can't best describe what this is going to look like as a CRD doing work on behalf of a declarative config. So it's going to be
Right.
more, yeah.
Yeah. We'll see. But like I'm trying to keep it simple and effective. I just want it to be easy for people to hack on and build. That's like my main goal here. Like, you know. Um yeah. So anyways, so like I'm making some progress there. The other topic that I wanted to get into, unless you had some more comments on that one.
Nope.
Okay. So the other topic I wanted to get into was the idea of orphan machines, because I've been playing around with KubeMark a bunch, and like I've gotten deeper into this. And it looks like, at least with the KubeMark provider, if I make like a machine object by itself, and I make like the kubeadm config to go with it, and then like the KubeMark machine as well, like if I load all that up, the KubeMark controller will actually recognize the machine, and it starts to spawn a container, like it starts to do the thing. Right now I'm having a little problem at the moment where like when the controller, I guess it's the the bootstrap controller copies the secret that's going to be used by the ultimate like end instance or whatever. Like I'm having a problem there because like the kube config that gets loaded into, which is ostensibly the cloud secret for this provider, when that gets
Yeah.
loaded into the KubeMark pod, it's saying for some reason like it can't access the file or whatever. And like I can see the secret, I can see the volume mount. Like I'm like, why can't it open this file or whatever? So like I think that we might be able to use the orphan machine process, but we'll need to
The
make
thing you're
sure.
describing doesn't seem like it's like I can't find my machine set or I can't find my
Right.
machine. It doesn't seem like a symptom of that. So
Right, exactly. So at least the core controllers aren't complaining about that. Every provider we might need to look at to see if like, does the OpenStack provider do some sort of check or whatever. But like it seems
right.
like the core controllers aren't doing that. And of course the KubeMark controller isn't looking for it either. So
Cool. We might want to be careful about how much longer we use the orphan term, just because that suggests that we're maybe orphaning something when
Yeah.
it's more like a Venus sprung from the skull of Zeus type situation. Like there's no
Right,
parent.
right.
There was never a parent. It's not like the parent left
Yeah,
or the parent
totally.
was garbage collected or something.
Maybe we should like, you know, just refer to them as like, carpenter owned for now or something.
Singleton machines? I don't know. It's just semantics, but if
No, but
someone like Fabrizio is following, he might be thinking that we're creating something like a machine set or a machine deployment and then deleting it without cleaning up its children, which is not what we're
yeah.
doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think at some level we're going to have to probably go back to I think once we start doing this more, we're going to have to go back to the main cluster API group and be like, okay, is there like, should we
Yeah.
update machine deployments to have some field that says like there's a whole bunch of heterogeneous machines here and changing the replica count might not do something, or like, yeah, is there something we need to do? Because yeah, like ultimately you'll have all these machines, they'll have no owner reference. Although I think looking at it, I think we could set the owner reference to like the cluster basically, and then like, the cluster owns them. So if you deleted the cluster, they would presumably go away then by extension. But do we want to have some other object that they could be owned by so that you could group them in some way or something? Like, I don't know.
I think the more generic solution would be to introduce a concept of like externally owned. So it's outside of CAPI's scope. So this is a machine that the CAPI doesn't know. Some actor is responsible, but so I don't know if that becomes a metadata
That's like, to me,
decoration
that
or something.
yeah, no, I think you've hit right on it though, because we have a lot of things in Cappy world where it's like we allow an externally owned or managed something to do it. And having like a formalized way to talk about machines that are externally owned by like another controller, that almost
Yeah,
perfectly fits into this paradigm, right? Because then like Carpenter could own all the machines basically, and you'd know
that's
where
right.
they're coming from. Yeah, totally.
So essentially, Carpenter, in this instance, Carpenter's just borrowing the API to describe a machine, borrowing the API from Cluster API, but it is in no need of its reconciliation.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes good sense to me. So I think that's something we'll probably have to take back to the group. Um, but it sounds like maybe we got some good ideas there. Anyway, so this is the things I've been looking at. I have like another kind of topic too that I probably want to bring back to the group at some point. Um, but like I think price information is going to be something that we'll need to talk about with like I was thinking about this earlier today to like price information and like dynamic inventory type stuff, right? Like, or like inventory discovery.
So this might be something that, right. So this is obviously going to be Cloudflare specific. I feel like there isn't too much work in the AWS and Azure side to standardize what they're currently using in their providers as a reusable library, so it could be referenced, and that could be a model for. We could almost, if we could standardize the way that looked as a library inside those provider projects, then for other cloud infra providers, like if say GCP doesn't want to implement Carpenter, but it wants to be able to leverage CAPI's provider for CapG, then it could emulate the way that AWS and Azure have defined these pricing inventory, all the libraries that exist that localize that logic for GCP, just using GCP as an example. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get what you're
Because
saying.
I think that we would all like for AWS and Azure, we would not rewrite that. We would borrow that. There'd be one standardized API to get all that information, and then the CAPI provider for AWS and the CAPI provider for Azure, speaking of the Carpenter provider, would reuse that so that it could be maintained in that one place.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And like another way that I was thinking about this too was kind of like going back to the cluster API community and saying like, okay, so right now, like if I wanted to discover the machines in a cluster, I would basically just get the infrastructure machine templates, right? Or get the whatever machine, the infrastructure, whatever machine templates to see them all. But I wonder, like, one of the things I want to push into the upstream or into the cluster API community is the notion of like, okay, like right now we have these infrastructure machines and it's like, the user defines them and creates them, or they come from the provider or something. But like, there should be a way for a user to understand information about the infrastructure they're on that could be surfaced. So things like what we started to do with the scale from zero, where it's like, as a user, could I look at these objects in the cluster to know what the shape of a machine is, without necessarily just looking at the node object? Could I look at the infrastructure machine object and know what that node is, right? Or could I know what like the price of a spot instance is at any given time based on a cluster API object, right? So like, so that I don't have to leave Kubernetes and go to the cloud to get the information. Could I get the information from Kubernetes itself? And so I think this is going to be important. Like,
interesting.
Because
I mean, I wonder if that's going to be not part of the machine object, but part of the infra machine object. Because you're describing to me a combination of like metadata and status information.
Right.
Because some of the stuff is not going to be integral. Like the pricing is going to be, that's appropriate to surface as a status, I think.
Right. And this is where I was wondering, like, do we need some sort of like discovery API that could be enacted in cluster API world so that a user could say like, I would like to create this API object, which will cause the provider to go and surface like fresh information or something, right? So rather than the controllers always reconciling like price information, I could say like, give me a spot instance price check on the provider, and I'm going to make this object. And then like the status gets filled in with like some information or something. Like, I don't know,
But I feel like that's what's going on in the Carpenter runtime, in the provider runtime.
It is.
And then based on the outcomes, a node claim would be yielded from that. If, for example, in a consolidation type outcome where some pricing threshold it's now gone below a threshold, so it's like, oh, okay, we can actually get a cheaper machine, or we can get some set of cheaper machines and garbage collect these more expensive machines.
Right.
And you've got the node claims that get created to actually eventually yield, in our case, machines, and then infra machines, and then coordinate and drain moving workloads over.
Right.
And so you're nodding. Everything sounds like I'm not saying anything interesting. What's different about that and what you're describing?
Right. So like what I want to see is like, so right now the individual provider, right? Like Carpenter Azure, right? Whenever Carpenter wants to do something, the Azure provider looks into the Azure inventory and says, these are the prices or whatever. And then Carpenter makes a decision, right? What I'm thinking is if we end up building this, like, if we had a generic cluster API provider, right? It's one thing just to match resources, like the machine is this big, it can hold this many pods. But if we could push the cluster API community to design an API where pricing information could be pushed back up, right? We could start to unlock other features of not only Carpenter, but of cluster API, of the cluster autoscaler. Because what I want to see is like, without going down below the cluster API level, can I query price information from cluster API? So like, for example, the Carpenter cluster API provider, the cluster itself, or really the management cluster, is the cloud provider. That's our source of information for what types of machines we know about and everything that we can do. So what I want to see is like Carpenter cluster API asks the cluster, what instances can I make, right? And it does that by doing a get infrastructure machine templates or whatever, right? And now it has a list of those. if those machines had information in their status about the current pricing or the size of the machine, now we can start to build this model where like Carpenter is talking to Cluster API. Cluster API harvests all the infrastructure templates, provides them back to Carpenter as the instance type list. Carpenter looks at the instance type list, chooses what it wants, makes node claims. The CAPI provider takes the node claims, turns them into these externally owned machines and creates them in the cluster. And now we can start to have this thing where Carpenter can make decisions based off more than just the topology of the machine. It could use like pricing information as well. And I think that's what people are going to really want at some level.
Cool. I don't fully grok the difference between that and just Carpenter's, the provider runtime doing it. But I suppose what I've been thinking is in this pan provider model, we the runtime gets overloaded with a bunch of like, runtime configuration, provider equals AWS, in which case our provider is smart enough to know how to source that information, how to figure out how to call AWS at runtime by pulling in those external libraries, because I'm in AWS context at this point.
Right.
You seem to be saying something where instead of doing that, we would source information from the Cluster API resources themselves.
Right.
The Cluster API would become authoritative for all that information.
Right. That's what I want to see. I want to see Cluster.
Are you thinking of that like in a cache kind of way? Like it's a cache representation of the source of truth? Because the source of truth is ultimately going to come from AWS in this example.
It comes from what the ultimate source of truth is, the concrete provider, right? And we want Cluster API, what I would like is I want to see that contract moved up to Cluster API so that Carpenter can just talk to Cluster API. And then it knows what's available to it based on the features that Cluster API or the data that Cluster API is making available to it, right? Because what I think would be super powerful would be if we have a Carpenter Cluster API provider that can run on any CAPI cluster, right? And yes, maybe on some clusters it's more full featured because like those providers have exposed, deeper information. But even on clusters where only minimal information is exposed, Carpenter could still operate and create these things. And so I think we need to bubble up some of this data to the Cluster API, API, so that we could then get it, because we don't necessarily want to have specific like implementations. So that like you're choosing Cluster API, but it's Cluster API AWS flavor or whatever, like, because that's just adding more like complexity to the matrix of options we have, right?
I kind of follow it. I'm kind of following. I'll think about that. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, so this is where I'd like to go, because I think there's a lot of like, not only would it be good for Carpenter, but I think it would also be good for like Cluster Autoscaler, because right now Cluster Autoscaler can do things like it can make pricing decisions for you, right? Like it can choose cheaper instances if you give it the data. But because Cluster API doesn't provide any of that data, we don't use that expansion method in the Cluster Autoscaler. We just report,
see what you're saying. Yeah.
We give back a not implemented or whatever, right? So like this is something, and the reason I'm bringing up a lot of this is because I've been doing some studies internally on like cost analysis between different configurations of like Autoscaler and Carpenter. And, I've been looking at a lot of this data, and I have a feeling that like for Cluster API users, this is the kind of thing where like, if we could surface some of this pricing information, even regardless of the Carpenter discussion, we could make a meaningful impact for Cluster API users, because they'll be able to say like, you know what, like I can reduce my costs of running Kubernetes now by like, just by switching on this option that says use the cheapest instances or whatever, right? So
right.
And I mean, I personally think that's kind of a big deal, but it's going to take a lot to create the contracts that would be there so that a provider could say, all right, we're going to surface this kind of information through CAPI or something,
Yeah, it's definitely a big deal. I mean, not only do we live in a world where we want to be responsible, but we now live in a world post ChatGPT where there's literally not enough compute for the things that people want to do. So
right. Yeah, totally. Right.
It's gone from a sort of socially responsible climate decision to now like a business.
Right.
The world's funny. World moves in funny ways.
Right. And this could also open the doors on other possibilities too, right? Like we might expose environmental or like, like power consumption
Oh yeah.
through the same kind of interface, right? And it's like, I think that this is the kind of stuff that enriches like cluster API, or at least the experience for the users. So yeah, that's what I
Cool.
was thinking.
Great. Well, I just came to hang out, so I don't have any agenda. I'm busy with a million other things, so I'm not thinking about this stuff actively. Really grateful that you are.
Well, I appreciate the sounding board at the very least, because it helps to kind of push the idea forward. So like, yeah, for what it's worth, like I appreciate the discussion.
Cool. I hope so. Great.
And hopefully we'll get to meet up again at like a KubeCon soon or something,
Yeah, I'm not going to Paris.
Yeah, me neither.
Combination of like didn't get funded and still have a baby, 1-year-old now.
Wow.
That's a good set of excuses to punt. But Salt Lake City is probably something I should force myself to go to. So are you aiming for Salt Lake City?
Yeah, I'll try to go for sure.
Cool.
Hopefully.
That'd be great.
Yeah, at least the travel's not too bad to Salt Lake City.
That's definitely true.
As opposed to Paris or whatever.
Well, Paris is, I don't want to go to Paris and go to a conference.
Yeah, totally. Like I don't want to spend 5 days inside looking at the inside of the whatever dome,
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for the discussion, Jack. And I guess I'll catch you online probably.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Mike.
All right, later, Jack.
Bye.